are said to have been put to death by Mohammed Kubri's command during the 5 years of his Grand Vizierate. The chief executioner of Constantinople, Zulfikar, confessed afterwards that he himself had strangled more than 4,000 and thrown them into the Bosphorus. Von Hammer, who repeats the accredits these numbers, states that the aged despot, who thus marked every month of his ministry by the sacrifice of more than 500 lives, had acquired a reputation for mildness and humanity. When he was provincial governor, it is fair to suppose that he lavished human life when Grand Vizier, not out of any natural cruelty in his disposition, but from the belief that he could not otherwise suppress revolt and anarchy and maintain complete obedience to his authority. The pace at which the restoration of order was brought under Mohammed Kubrili was indeed fearful, but so excessive it was not paid in vain. The revolts which had raged in Transylvania and Asia Minor were quelled, the naval strength of the empire was revived. The Dardanelles were fortified, the Ottoman power beyond the Black Sea was strengthened by the erection of castles on the Dnieper and the Don. And so the war in Candia still lingered. The islands of Lemnos and Tenedos were recovered from the Venetians. His own authority in the empire was unshaken until the last hour of his life, and he obtained for his still more celebrated son Ahmed Kubrili the succession to the Grand Vizierate. It is said that old Kubrili, when on his death's bed, 31st October 1661, after recommending his son as the future vizier, gave the young sultan four special rules to follow. One was never to listen to the advice of women. Another was never to let a subject grow overrich. The third was to keep the Kubrili treasure full by all possible means, and the last to be continually on horseback and keep his armies in constant action. Sultan Mohammed IV was now advancing towards manhood, but he was of far too weak a character to govern for himself. His great delight was the chase, and to this he devoted all his energies and all his time. Fortunately for his empire, he placed the most implicit confidence in Ahmed Kubrili, the new vizier, and maintained his favorite minister in power against all the numerous intrigues that were directed against him. Ahmed Kubrili was the real ruler of Turkey from 1661 to his death in 1676, and he is justly eulogized both of Ottoman and Christian historians as the greatest statesman of country. He was only 26 years of age when he was called to govern the empire, but his naturally high abilities had been improved by the best education that the murderers of Constantinople could supply, and he had learned practical statesmanship as a provincial governor and general during the ministry of his father. Ahmed Kubrili could be as stern as his sire when duty to the state required severity, and he was equally tenacious in not permitting the least encroachment on his authority. But he was usually human and generous, and his most earnest endeavors were directed to mitigate the burdens of imperial taxation, and to protect the people from the feudal exactions of the Sipahis and from the arbitrary violence of the Pasha and other local functionaries. Like his father, Ahmed Kublai commenced his administration by securing himself against any cabals of the ulama, and he gave at the same time a noble rebuke to the chief of that order, who spoke the divan against the memory of the late Grand Vizier. Ahmed Kubrili said to him, Mufti, if my father sentenced men to death, he did so by the sanction of the fatwa. The Mufti answered, if I gave him my fatwa, it was because I feared lest I should myself suffer under his cruelty. Effendi rejoined the Grand Vizier, is it for thee, who art a teacher of the law of the Prophet, to fear God the less his creature? The Mufti was silent. In a few days afterwards he was deposed and banished to Rhodos, and his important station given to Sanizade, a friend on whom Ahmed Kubrili could rely. It was the civil administration of the Turkish Empire that the genius of Ahmed Kubrili found its best field of exercise, but he was soon called on to fulfill the military duties of the Grand Vizierate and head of Ottoman armies in the war with Austria, which broke out in 1663. This, like most of the other wars between the two empires, originated in the troubles and the seditions, which were chronic for a century and a half in Hungary and Transylvania. After several conflicts in minor importance during 1661 and 1662 between the respective partisans of Austria and the part in these provinces, who were aided against each other by the neighboring pashas and commandants, an Ottoman army was collected by the Grand Vizier on a scale of grandeur worthy of the victorious days of Suleiman Kanuni and Koprili, resolved not only to complete the ascendancy of the Turks in Hungary and Transylvania, but to crush entirely and finally the power of Austria. Mohammed IV marched with the troops from Constantinople to Adrianople, but there he remained behind to resume his favorite hunting, while his Grand Vizier led the army against the enemy. The Sultan placed the sacred standard of the Prophet in Kubrili's hands at parting, and on the 8th June 1663, that formidable ensign, the Turkish war, was displayed at Belgrade. Kubrili had under his command 121,000 men, 123 field pieces, and 12 heavy battering cannon, 60,000 camels, and 10,000 mules. With this imposing force, he overran the open country of Hungary and Transylvania, almost without opposition, and besieged and besieged and captured the strong city of Neuhausen in the September of that year, which was the most brilliant achievement that the Turks had effected in Europe since the Battle of Tserestes more than 50 years before. The vizier after this siege did not recommence active operation with his main army until the spring of the following year, but his light troops spread devastation far and wide through Austria. In May 1664, Kupri advanced and crossed the river Mur, and he besieged and captured the fortress of Serivar, which the Turks dismantled and set fire to, and on the 7th July, as a mark of contempt for the reigning Emperor of Austria, by whom it had been founded. From the ruins of Serivar, the Ottoman army marched northward, passing by the western extremity of Lake Balaton. They captured Egervar, Kipornak, and other strong places, and on the 26th July, the Turks reached the right bank of the river Rab, near to the town of Kermant. Could they cross the river, the remainder of the march against Vienna seemed easy. The Imperial army which opposed them in this campaign was inferior to them in numbers, but happily for Austria, that army was commanded by one of the ablest generals of the age, who was destined to gain the first great victory of Christendom and a pitched battle in open field against the full force of the Turkish arms. Count Raymond and Montecuculi was, like many other of the greatest generals known in modern history, an Italian. He was born at Modena of a noble family of that duchy in 1608. He entered into the Austrian service and acquired distinction in the latter part of the 30 Years' War. And afterwards in hostilities against Poland. In 1664, he was named Generalissimo of the imperial forces and sent to check the menacing progress of the Turks. The Austrian and Hungarian army, which was placed under Montecuculi's command, was weak in numbers, and at the opening of the campaign he was unable to prevent the vizier Kupri from crossing the Mur and reducing the Christian cities that lay between the river and the Rab. But while the Turks were engaged in these operations, Montecuculi effected a junction with the auxiliary troops of the States of the Empire and also with the valuable force of French troops which had voluntarily marched under the Count of Coligny and other noblemen to serve in the Hungarian War. With his army thus strengthened, Montecuculi took up a position near Kermant on the Rab, covering the road to Vienna, and from the breadth and rapidity of the river in that place, the attempts made by the Ottoman vanguard to force the passage were easily repulsed. Kupri now marched up the Rab, along the right bank towards Styria, closely followed along the left bank by Montecuculi, who thus turned the enemy farther away from the Austrian capital and also from the Turkish reserves which were concentrating at Ofen and Stuyvesant. Several efforts of the Turks to cross the river were checked by the imperialists, but at last the armies marched past the point where the Laufritz flows into the Raab, in the vicinity of the village of the St. Gotthard, and then the simple stream of the Raab wanted depth and breadth sufficient to present a serious obstacle to the Turks. Both armies therefore hated and prepared for the battle which appeared to be inevitable. Some overtures for negotiation first took place, in which the Turkish officers behaved with the utmost arrogance. When Renningen, the Austrian envoy, spoke of the restoration of Neuhausen to the emperor, the vizier and his pashas laughed at him and asked whether any one had ever heard of the Ottoman voluntarily giving up a conquest to the Christians. They refused to admit the terms of the old Treaty of Sint-Waterok as a basis for a peace and said that peace must be granted, if at all, on principles created by the recent successes of the Sublime Porte. Montecucculi continued his preparations for battle. He issued careful directions to his troops, particularizing the order of their array, the relative positions of each corps, the depth of the lines, and the disposal of the baggage and stores. The 1st of August 1664 saw the result of Montecucculi's siege dispositions and the first great proof that the balance of superiority between the Ottoman and Christian arms had at last been changed. The convent of St. Gotthard, which has given name to this memorable battle, is the right bank of the Raab, at the little distance above its confluence with the Laufritz. A space of level ground extends along the right bank of the Raab westward from the convent and village of St. Gotthard to the village of Windischdorf, also on the right bank of the river. These two villages formed the extreme wings of the Turkish position before the battle. Along the left bank of the river there is an extent of the level ground of equal length with that on the right side, but of the much greater breadth. It was on the left side that the much greater breadth, and it was here the left side that the conflict took place. In the center of the plain, on the left side, that is to say, in the center of the imperial position, stands the village of Mogasdorf. And immediately opposite of Mogasdorf, the river bends and describes an arc towards the southern Turkish side. This greatly facilitated the passage of the river by the vizier, as he was enabled to place guns in battery on each side convex of the stream, and sweep away any troops that disputed the landing place on the other bank. In the center of the bend of the river, Montecucculi placed the auxiliary German troops of the empire in the center of his line and near to the village Mogendorf. Mogastor. The Austrians and Hungarians were in the right wing. The French auxiliaries formed his left. The Turks had a large superiority in numbers, and in personal courage they were inferior to no possible antagonists. But the military discipline of the Turkish soldiers has become lamentably impaired since the days of Suleiman, when it commanded the envious administration of its Christian foes. It had even declined rapidly since the time even the last great battle between Turks and the Germans was fought at Crestes, 1596. The deterioration of the intelligence and skill of the Ottoman officers was still more conspicuous. On the opposite side, the German and the Ottoman armies of Western Christendom had acquired many improvements in their weapons, their tactics, and their general military organization during the 30 Years' War, which had called into action the genius of such commanders as Tilly, Wallenstein, Gustavus Adolphus, Bernhard Torstensson, Turenne, and Montecucculi himself. The Turkish artillery, though numerous, and was now cumbrous and ill-served compared with the German. The Janissaries had given up to use the pike, which seems to have been one of their weapons in Suleiman's time. And the Ottoman army was entirely deficient in foot brigades of steady spearmen, and also in heavily armed regular cavalry. The German infantry was now formed of pikemen and musketeers, and part of their horse consisted of heavy cuirassiers regiments, which in Montecucculi's judgment were sure, if a fair opportunity of charging were given them, to ride down Turkish infantry or cavalry without it being possible for any serious resistance to be offered to them. In that great generous opinion, the want of the pike, which calls the queen of weapons, was a fatal defeat in the Turkish military system. The shall find the Cavalier Floral half a century afterwards expressing a similar judgment with reference to the negligence of the Turks in not adopting the invention of the bayonet. Montecucculi's criticisms on the defect in the Turkish armies were written by him after the Battle of St. Gotthard, but his military sagacity must have divined them as soon as he observed the visible troops and made trial of their tactics and prowess in the early operations of the campaign. But the Turks themselves, before they fought at St. Gotthard, knew not their own deficiencies. They were flushed with triumph at the advantage which they had hitherto gained under Ahmed Kuprili, and with full confidence in their chief and themselves, they advanced about 9 in the morning at the 1st of August 1664 to the Rab and began the passage of the eventful stream. Kurbeli had placed his batteries along the sides of the arc of the stream, which has already been described, and his emissaries, who were drawn up the Turkish center, crossed the river without much loss and attacked and carried the village of Mogasdorf. The center of the Christians was thus completely broken, and the Ottoman appeared to be certain of victory. When Montecucculi brought succor from the right wing, Prince Charles of Lorraine, who in this battle gave the prelude of his long and brilliant career, led his regiment of Austrian heavy cavalry to their charge in person, and killed with his own land of commander of the Grand Vizier's guards the advanced troops of the Turkish center, thus taken in flank by the Austrian cavalry were driven back to the Rab. Mogastor was attacked by the imperialists, and set on fire, but the Janissaries, who had entrenched themselves in the village, refused to retreat or surrender and kept their post till they perished in the flames. With obstinacy, says Montecucculi, worthy to be reflected on and admired, Kurbeli brought large reinforcements over from the right bank, and Montecucculi now sent word to the Count of Coligny and the French in his left wing that it was time for them to aid him with all their might. Coligny sent him instantly 1,000 infantry and 2 squadrons of cavalry under the Duke de la Feuillade of Bregues. When Kurbeli saw the French coming forward with their shaven chins and cheeks and powdered perquisites, he asked scornfully of one of his attendants, "Who are these young girls?" But the young girls, as he termed them, without regarding the formidable Turkish battle cry of Allah Allah, rushed upon the Turks and cut them down, shouting on their part, "Allons, allons, tu, tu." These Janissaries who escaped this carnage remembered long afterwards the French cry of "Allons, tu, tu." And the Duke of Feuillade was for many years talked of in their barracks as Fouladi, which means the man of steel.